Good evening. I'd like to welcome you all here to the Forum Lecture Series. As you know, the sponsors, and I would very much like to thank this evening BBB Architects for sponsoring this particular evening with Kenneth Frampton. As many of you know also, this is the end of a day which we've had at Carlton. We've been exploring under a symposium, the Frascati Symposium 1, called Towards a Critical Phenomenology. And it was my intention to offer Professor Kenneth Frampton an opportunity to come here and express not a keynote before a lecture or before a series, but possibly a postscript or a keynote that moves us on, that takes us somewhere else. The Beatles. 20 years ago today, of course, Sgt. Pepper taught the band to play. They were going in and out of style, guaranteed to raise a smile. 20 years ago today, I was writing a book which was called The End of Finnish Architecture. Sorry, that was no cue to the. Well, we've had some glitches in technology today. 20 years ago, I was writing a book called The End of Finnish Architecture. It was a simple premise, that with the end of a certain type of architect, Finnish architecture would begin chasing its own tail. The brilliance of their work from the 20th century would need redefinition. The work of architects like Saarinen, Aalto, and Pietila, and others, would be part of that redefinition. It might need to take a phenomenological turn. Just might. It was immediately mocked, of course, and I was nicknamed the perma-critic of Finnish architecture. But in that book, I wrote a small chapter called Waiting for Mr. F. Mr. F was, of course, the man we are here to listen to tonight. Mr. F had identified the brilliance of this country's contribution to architecture with his wonderful open sentence, quote, "Many reasons besides prosperity must be involved for the manifestation of so much talent in such a small country." End of quote. The small paragraph I wrote, I was quite proud of. Looking back now, a touch naff, a touch of gonzo journalism, which I was trying to bring about into the writing of architecture. Quote, "There is a terrifying specter. Both sides in the mudslinging about architectural propriety in Finland and correctness are now, imagine it, waiting for Mr. F. Mr. F becomes the chosen demigod. Godot in a pure wool flea market overcoat. Do both sides heed the authority that bad? What an intolerable role for Mr. F. How will he pronounce on this subject? End of quote. That was 20 years ago today, this month. Both sides seeking an authenticity. You'll see in the program, are they positivists, cloud shovelers? Maybe both. Yet I had not met Mr. F until January 2012 in Toronto. We were both going to see a man about a dog. I was coming out of the Gents at the TIFF building, and he was going into the Gents. We shook hands, and I realized I had met the demigod. You may smile. I hope you do. But one of the main reasons that I am so pleased that Mr. F, Professor Kenneth Frampton, accepted this invitation to give a forum lecture here in the National Gallery and to conclude our first Frascati Symposium was to give him the chance to be free of all those labels, all the critical and uncritical commentary that has been applied to him and his works, to all the books he has written. Kenneth Frampton is much more important as a thinker than that. There was no idea to handcuff him to phenomenology, ontology, hermeneutic communism, or phrenology. Kenneth Frampton has simply been the most consistent and forthright architectural thinker, critic, and historian for over 4 decades. He opts not for my gonzo journalism, which I am thankful for. He writes with a rigor and sensitivity that has ridden the waves of architectural fancies, trends, and more than the occasional market nonsense that now consumes architecture into the New York Times style pages. He writes about the sensitive, proven architects just as much as he, Mr. F, is himself, with no shadow of a doubt, sensitive, proven. We are now in what Edward Said calls the late or third stage of an artist's or thinker's life. The option is to confirm thoughts that have been uttered before, or to take a risk, to lead us to an emancipatory stage in our thinking and architecture. We are talking here of a listening and emancipatory intelligence, of the sort described by the 13th century scholar and poet Rumi. There is no better person to truly, finally, get us out of a still lingering 20th century and into the 21st century and offer us some pointers. Hard times, bleak times, fiscal cliffs, or destitute times. When I think of these things, of hard times, of the bleak house, and all that David Copperfield kind of crap, as Holden Caulfield would say from J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye. All that stuff that has been written about architecture, I would still turn to Kenneth Frampton. You will see him here in a photograph that his dear friend Michael Karapetian took when they were researching and surveying the Maison de Verre. We have the young Mr. F on his back, I've no doubt doing drawings. I will ask him when we have the little conversation afterwards on the 2 black chairs, what exactly was he doing down there? But as I said, with all that has been spoken about architecture, I would turn to Kenneth Frampton. Sometimes a gift understood, sometimes a gift misunderstood. Kenneth Frampton is quite simply one of the gifts the 20th century gave us, and which the 20th century should cherish, and cherish well. The fiscal cliff, the architectural cliff. The question has to be asked, what role for an architect in destitute times? I have the greatest pleasure welcoming Kenneth Frampton to the floor to address us. Ladies and gentlemen, Monsieur Godot in a pure wool overcoat. Mr. F, Professor Kenneth Frampton.
Oh my God, what a build-up. Yes, that was very unique. I mean, I've been introduced, but that was unique. And very pleasurable. I'm honored to be here, and I thank Roger and members of the Carleton Faculty of Architecture in this university for inviting me. And also it's an honor to speak on an occasion which is a kind of homage to Marco Frascari, who I haven't seen for a very, very long time. In fact, I haven't seen Marco since he was teaching in Penn with Joseph Rickwert. And I was telling Indabir today that given my proclivities for provincial architecture, perhaps one can call it, provincial Scandinavian architecture, I never understood why neither Marco Frascari nor Joseph Rickwert had any time for Jorn Utzon, something that bewildered me entirely, but in any case, it didn't actually influence me. I still think that Utzon was a rather extraordinary architect. I don't know, what am I doing here? The wonderful Bruce Chatwin question. And then this followed up by this question that what I might say would be emancipatory is asking a lot. And I should say, vis-a-vis what I'm going to try to articulate, that I have this depressing habit, or rather I should say, we have this depressing habit, meaning my wife and myself, who could be, I think, dismissed as leftists, listening to Amy Goodman, Democracy Now! And that is not good for, maybe one shouldn't really try to have the evening meal and listen to Amy at the same time. But in any case, this has had this woman and her investigative journalism has had a certain impact on my view of the world over the last couple of years. Not that she's essential to getting the message, but anyway, she certainly reveals certain, nuances of all that, of what is happening or what we think might be happening today. And it isn't entirely a coincidence, but last night I gave a lecture in the school in Toronto on alto, in fact, and I'm entering my second or third alto hang-up, and this time, this question of I'm trying to make the argument that I think his legacy is a legacy that's still open to development, and for this generation, for your generation, and I try to make this case, and I don't think it's the easiest case to make, but I think there is a certain openness to the totality of alto's production and the method that is sort of behind that production, which can still be developed. And perhaps the most important thing of all is that I think he created a modern architecture which was accessible to ordinary people. I think he really succeeded in doing that. And perhaps there were not many others of his generation that came close to that achievement or even wanted to come that close to that achievement, I think. But anyway, this is all, I've written this piece and I will start to read it sooner or later. So I think the other thing I'd like to say about the piece, and also with reference to Roger Connor's remarks, as Mr. F, yes, I like that, is that, I think it's said by other people, but I think to some extent, and that might be true of all of us in a way, that, one could say that architects are always designing the same building, even when they design different buildings. And one could say that architect manqué, like myself, are always, with the same ideas, basically, the same obsessions. They're always giving the same spiel. And so I can't promise to give you any new spiel, but anyway, I found this thing, but I found the invitation extremely challenging because actually, yes, I mean, I suppose I do have to admit that I could be seen, I am seen as a kind of, in a disparaging sense, as a phenomenologist, I think. In fact, very recently, there was there's a ritual at Columbia which involves Mark Wigley talking to Peter Eisman. It happens every year, and I don't know how long this is going to go on, but in any case, there was the ninth, I think it was the ninth session, which amused Peter Eisman, cats and 9 lives and things like that, and anyway, it gave the opportunity for Eisman to sort of mount a frontal attack on the phenomenologists, which meant, of course, Joseph Rickwert, and I suppose, though it could well be Marco Foscari, and Dalibor Vézelay, and also, I don't know whether he mentioned me by name, but I'm surely I'm classified in the same honor roll. And yet, when I was asked to give this talk, I found it extremely difficult. I must say, challenging to know exactly how to respond to it. Respond to the theme of this conference, actually. And actually, this, what I have to say, would be better if it had a few illustrations. But I couldn't get it together to know what I was going to say until very late in the game. And so you just have to excuse me for the fact that I didn't get the images. It's a common practice, I believe, that a keynote speech is given at the beginning of a conference in order to set the tone and probably also influence the discourse in some way. In this instance, however, Roger Connor has seen fit to place my contribution at the end of the proceedings due to his intuition that what I have to say might be of relevance to the role to be played by phenomenology in the practice of architecture. Borrowing from Hölderlin's famous question, what are poets for? I told him I might open my address with the equally aphoretic question, what are architects for in a destitute time? Of course, that's of course the question that Hölderlin asks, what are poets for in a destitute time? But of course one might well begin by wondering, well, is this time so destitute after all, and question that. But perhaps the issue could be put more bluntly by saying, what is it? What should architects aspire to in an age which seems to be driven relentlessly towards the commodification of everything, including, of course, architecture? Thus, although we may discuss the other arts in terms of their apparent autonomy, say music or abstract painting, film maybe, I remain convinced that it's not possible to enter into a discussion about the design and realization of the built environment without venturing in somehow, however awkwardly, into the fields of philosophy and politics. This is surely due to the fact that, unlike the other arts, architecture is inextricably mixed up with what the father of phenomenology, Edmund Husserl, called the life world, in the midst of his project of returning to the things themselves, with reference to the indivisible cognitive and non-cognitive experience of the body being as it engages with the life world. In a recent issue of a Spanish architectural magazine devoted to the global boom in high-rise construction, the editor chose to feature on the cover a dramatic helicopter shot of Renzo Piano's recently completed Crystal Shard building in London, currently the highest building in Europe, situated just south of the Thames and overlooking in this particular image a panorama of the city of London with a diminutive toy-like tower bridge in the middle of the picture, and in the background other high-rises glowing in the sunset are scattered randomly across the city as far as the eye can see. While in the foreground there are building sites and tower cranes suggesting that other high-rises will soon come into being to challenge the present supremacy of the Shard. This spectacular image reminds captures at a glance what the society of spectacle has come to mean since Guy Debord first invented this term in his commentary, or rather, that wasn't the invention of it, but I'm referring to his commentary on the Society of Spectacle of 1988. And then he wrote the following thing, which I can almost remember by heart, because it made such an indelible impression on me. And I think about it often when I'm listening to Amy Goodman's Democracy Now! What Guy Debord wrote in 88 was, quote, "It is indeed unfortunate that human society should encounter such burning problems just when it has become materially impossible to make heard the least objection to the language of commodity. Just when power, quite rightly, because it is shielded by the spectacle from having to take any responsibility for its piecemeal and delirious decisions and justifications, believes that it no longer needs to think, and indeed can no longer think. It is sometimes said that science today is subservient to the imperatives of profit, but that is nothing new. What is new is the way the economy has now come to declare open war on humanity, attacking not only our possibilities for living, but our chances of survival. It is here that science, renouncing the opposition to slavery that once formed a significant part of its own history, has chosen to put itself in the service of spectacular domination," end quote. The hallucinatory and tedious phenomena of Manhattanizing the business districts of megalopolitan cities across the world, from New York to Sao Paulo, Singapore, Shanghai, Beijing, Mumbai, and Tokyo, to cite the more prominent examples of our unfortunate globalized building boom, reminds one that we have come a long way since the invention of the skyscraper and the touching efforts of Louis Sullivan, Daniel Burnham, and Cass Gilbert to come up with a humanist format for a high-rise building through the cunning disposition of ornament and through dividing the insistently repetitive form of a high-rise into bottom, middle, and top, like as though it were a fat, enlarged classical column. It's a long way from this moment to these early efforts to the heroic tectonic form of Norman Foster's HSBC high-rise building in Hong Kong of 1984, which proved, by the way, accidentally, to be the occasion for Tadao Ando's subsequent refusal to repeat the exercise for a Japanese developer with the words, quote, "I think that over a certain height, architecture is no longer possible." This worldwide proliferation of freestanding high structures is an apocalyptic fate which has yet to befall the provincial capital cities of Scandinavia, such as Oslo, Stockholm, Copenhagen, Helsinki, and Tallinn, which have so far been spared this spectacular form of anti-civic development. Although, as Johanne Pallasmaa recently informed me, I find it absolutely shocking prospect, that 40 such towers are now being envisaged as an embellishment of the Finnish capital. Despite that heroic moment, perhaps mythic, a few years ago, when Norman Foster refused to accept a nomination to build a high-rise there and categorically told the Finns, as rumor has it, that they should not contemplate building such structures in a fabric as delicate as Helsinki. One is aware that certain cities, long since harbinger of high-rise buildings, are able to maintain their image by virtue of the terrain in which they are situated. But aside from, I'm thinking, say, of Sydney and Manhattan, maybe Caracas, but even so, you know, the death of the postcard, as a continental newspaper already called it some 40 years ago, has by and large become the norm. The allusion is to the way in which the traditional European city crowns, i.e. cathedrals, celebrated as such in Bruno Taut's 1919 polemic Die Stadtkrone, have long since become compromised perceptually by the proliferation of high-rises all around them. Take, for instance, St. Paul's in London, which now is kind of attended by high-rises going on forever. In one way or another, we are immersed in that which the technocratic American planner Melvin Webber once had the temerity to identify as the non-place urban realm, positively, and community without propinquity, equally positively, in his book, Explorations in Urban Structures. His slogan, non-place urban realm, enabled him to influence the plan for the last British new town of Milton Keynes of 1972, in which a distorted version of the LA grid was superimposed over the highly configurated landscape of rural Buckinghamshire. It was just such an indifference to place that prompted Gertrude Stein's clairvoyant utterance, "There is no more there," and later Francois Choet's shrewd observations that were it not for the graphic signs, all these late modern megalopoli would be entirely non-negotiable. No landmarks, no nothing, just the signs. Or later still, Marc Auger's conclusion that the generic megalopolis has now attained the status of being a universal non-place. It's a famous book of his called Non-Lieu. But given all this, it's now perhaps beholden on me, on this occasion anyway, to own up to my own point of departure, which some of you may not be familiar with. So let me say first and foremost that I was educated as an architect at the AA School in London in the first half of the 50s, in what was still the post-World War II, was part of post-war World War II welfare state Europe, where teachers and students alike still subscribed to the manifest destiny of the modern project, as Jürgen Habermas would later characterize the modern movement in his famous essay, Technology and Science as Ideology, of 1968, which was dedicated to Herbert Marcuse on his birthday. And here I should also confess that I have been engaged, it seems to me, as Mr. F, for a sort of never-ending rearguard action, so to speak, for virtually all my adult life after practicing architecture in London and in Tel Aviv on a small scale between 1956 and 1965. The inversion of these dates is a bit funny. And subsequently becoming a studio instructor in design and a teacher of history theory of the modern movement over the last misspent 40 years of my life in the States, first in Princeton and now long since in the GSAPP in Columbia. Thus, in a quixotic attempt to clarify further what has been my take on the modern predicament in general, and on the challenge of practicing architecture in particular over the past 4 decades, I will attempt to touch on some of my successive reactions to the demise of the liberative modern project across time. So I would like to remark very briefly on the impact of the years, let's say 1960, 1965, 1972, 1980, and 83, the years that in one way or another had an impact on me because of either things that happened to me or experiences I had or moments of what would perhaps pass for achievements. 1960 was exceptionally crucial for me because of Siedlung Haarlem, built outside Bern to the designs of Atelier 5, in which I stayed briefly in the early 60s. Haarlem, as you may recall, was perhaps the first categoric post-war demonstration of the place-creating potential of low-rise, high-density housing as a viable alternative to the ever-expanding suburban sprawl of the megalopolis. It seemed to proffer a modern alternative that was neither the anomie of the multi-story apartment slabs of the welfare state, disconnected from the ground, nor the pitched roof garden city pathos of the Anglo-American new town, nor, for that matter, the private arrivist populism of Levittown. 1965 was equally crucial for me for the initial exhilarating experience of encountering New York, which had the surprising effect of politicizing me, since I became aware there, exactly, on the New Jersey Turnpike, and flying over Manhattan in a kind of golden evening light, I became aware of this enormous consumption of gasoline and electric power. I became aware for the first time of the full scope of the American industrial machine, combined with the laissez-faire consumption of the Pax Americana, which seemed to have few doubts in itself as to the manifest destiny prior, that is, to the persecution and denouement of the Vietnam War. 1965 would be important to me because of two books, Hannah Arendt's The Human Condition and Herbert Marcuse's Eros and Civilization. Actually, Thomas Stevens, who was the kind of mythical figure of the 50s and 60s in London, gave me The Human Condition, and Alan Cahoon, the late Alan Cahoon, gave me Eros and Civilization. Reading Arendt made me aware for the first time of the difference between a place form, though that's not her terminology, as a space of human appearance, which is her terminology, to refer to that book, and product form, which is actually a term invented by Max Bill, as something destined for immediate use and consumption. Equally inspiring was Marcuse's synthesis of the analytical insights of Marx and, in a way, Husserl and Freud in an effort to overcome the wasteful cycle of both conspicuous consumption and the state of perpetual war, which we still seem to be addicted to. I mean, the big impact on Arendt for me is to explain, not, inadvertently in a way, that what is the difference between architecture and building, building as process, as something that's never finished, and architecture as a kind of world-creating act. Although obviously these things overlap, but see, I think for innocent family whose offspring decides to study architecture, one of the bewildering things is, or certainly used to be, well, what is that? What's the difference between an architect and a builder, for God's sake? What is that? What is architecture? Or the lovely story that Renzo Piano once told me, that when he told his contractor father, very successful contractor father, that he wanted to go to architecture school, the father looked at him and said, "What do you want to do that for? We know how to build. You don't have to go to architecture school. What are you talking about?" And so that kind of thing. I should also mention in passing my experience of Expo 67 here in Canada, where I witnessed, amongst other things, the daring technocratic innocence of Moshe Safdie's habitat. Maybe the last time he was innocent, because this building isn't exactly innocent. And his now seemingly regressive, prefabricated Babylonian extravaganza, which perhaps could also be this building, but then which provided for houses and terraces suspended in the air on top of a giant reinforced concrete geodesic space frame, Pache Bucky Fuller. This was the converse of that which had already been demonstrated in Haarlem, amongst other low-rise high-density housing schemes, such as Puckenau in Austria, which were then being realized in many other places in Europe. It's significant that Expo 67 was also the last occasion, as it so happens, that the United States made any significant effort at all to represent itself in a positive light. I'm alluding, of course, to Bucky's colossal geodesic sphere constructed on the Expo site. This sublime sphere, dramatically penetrated by a sightseeing monorail and containing a display of elegant sort of astrophysical objects, as I remember. After this tour de force, the US lost all interest in participating in subsequent world exhibitions. In Osaka, they used a second-hand geodesic dome. Boy, were they cheap. Presumably because they felt, but that is, American power felt, that this was no longer an efficient way of proselytizing itself, that, there's much, it wasn't where it's at anymore, world exhibitions. 1980 was a crucial year for me because of the publication of that book. Mr. F's Modern Architecture, A Critical History, which coincided with the overtly postmodern Venice Biennale. That is, Paulo Portuguese's The Presence of the Past and the End of Prohibition. On the, what can we say, ideological creation of which I was invited to serve as an advisor, and from which I immediately resigned when I realized the full extent of the cultural cynicism, you know, making heroes out of Philip Johnson and so on. A short time afterwards, I first encountered Paul Ricoeur's essay of 1963. No, that's wrong, 61. Universal Civilization and National Cultures, which had been recommended to me by the Czech émigré architect phenomenologist Dalibor Vesely. In fact, when this book was published, Andreas Papadakis, editor of Architectural Design, had a kind of fit of envy, God knows why, and persuaded Thames and Hudson to allow him to republish certain chapters from that book, and made a kind of big deal out of it and invited me to ask different critical writers to comment on the book, which, by the way, included also Alan Cahoon. And I asked Dalibor Vesely, who refused, basically, to do that, and recommended to me then Paul Ricoeur's Universal Civilization and National Cultures. And it set me off, really, in this direction of course, it's inevitable I would get to it sooner or later, critical regionalism. Because actually I'd had a sort of intuition about this, if you can say that, you know, when I was editor briefly of the magazine Architectural Design, when it seemed to me there was, but you know, it's partly a projection on my part, I think, but it seemed to me that there was a more intimate relationship between the architect and the provincial European city-state that I could find anywhere in the United Kingdom, you know. Like, for example, Ungers in relation to Cologne, or Gino Valli in relation to Udine, or Ernst Giesel in relation to Zurich, you know, and later Aris Konstantinides in relation to Athens, etc. You know, and I was able to do some special issues during my short stint there, where you saw this great photograph of Monica and myself just now touring Germany together. I mean, during that period, I was able to sort of focus on this kind of, you know, not overtly, I didn't talk about it, but by implication. And so out of this came this 1983 essay, Towards a Critical Regionalism, 6 points towards an architectural resistance. But I should also add that, you know, it appeared in Hal Foster's The Anti-Aesthetic. But I should also add, you know, because these things are quite close together, that, you know, the experience in Venice, because Robert Stern had invited me to this event in Venice, and then I resigned. Of course, it offends him no end. But I'm sure he didn't really care that much. But in any case, what I realized, because I also taught with Stern in Columbia, that you know, what I've been brought up on this idea of the modern project, the idea, you know, maybe, yes, kind of utopian idea that a kind of new world could, as it were, be created, you know, that was just, one couldn't even convince anybody about that anymore. And this, you know, reactionary postmodern stylistic game, which Stern was already into and which would be consummated by the Venice Biennale, meant that one had to try to find an alternative you know, way of regrounding the field. And so, you know, that leads me to this. Well, then, of course, the other thing I have to say, because 1980 is the Venice Biennale, and then in 1981, Alex Zonis and Liane Lefebvre write this very beautiful essay, The Grid and the Pathway, which is published in Architecture in Greece. And it's fascinating that, of course, by grid they meant the work of Aris Konstantinides, and by the pathway they meant Dimitri Pikionis. And in fact, I had already experienced Pikionis before, because when I was coming back from Israel, because I did this, I got sort of mixed up with a Sabra, and I went to Israel for a while and worked there as an architect. On the way back, I came for the first time in my life to Athens, and there, outside the Acropolis, is this kind of landscape park which is called Philopappou Hill, and I thought this was unbelievable. But when I came back to London and started to go on about this work of Piccionis, which is finished in '59, Greek friends, colleagues of mine, didn't know what the hell I was talking about. They sort of did know what I was talking about. They couldn't understand why I was so enthusiastic about it. But this is the pathway in the grid and the pathway essay. And the grid is simply the sort of rigorous reinforced concrete frame that Constantinides used for all these Xenia hotels that he designed in Greece during the 50s and very early 60s. The Venice Biennale and the pluralistic manner of the stylistic postmodernism exhibited in the Strada Novissima in the Arsenale made me realize that a rigorously rational modernity in architecture, such as we had inherited, so to speak, generically, from the idea of a liberative modernity, could no longer be taken at face value or sustained as an idea. This led me into trying to formulate a more realistic, applicable mode of practice which would be capable of both evoking and appealing to rooted values and towards experiencing and cultivating such values in a hybridized form against the whirlwind of a maximizing technology by which it was already clear we were sequestered on all sides. Inspired then by Zonis and Lefebvre's essay, The Grid and the Pathway, and their coinage of the term, and they are the figures that first used this term, critical regionalism, I attempted to elaborate on a regional sensibility, a series of attributes that such a grounded culture might possess. This led me to posit 6 points for an architecture of resistance, conceived as a mode of beholding, that's important, I think, to say, the general predicament, as much as being a potential for the cultivation of a more sensitive mode of practice, more sensitive and specific mode of practice. And in my essay towards a critical regionalism, I attempted to show how one might embrace and respond to Paul Ricoeur's challenge as to the necessity of becoming modern, but at the same time returning to sources. This is what he says. And he says it, of course, with particular reference to newly emerging nations, emerging from imperialism, and how to become modern and return to sources. I mean, to the sources in order to constitute the identity of the independent nation. That is to say, to the fundamental origins which he conceived as the ethical and mythical nucleus of mankind, i.e. culture, as opposed to the thrust of universal civilization, which for him was in effect universal technology. For me, this opposition between culture and civilization was evident as a latent tension in every architectural work, with the one implicating identity and rooted value, and the other being a manifestation of a seemingly objective technique. This last recalled Herbert Marcuse's assertion in Eros and Civilization that a technological a priori is a political a priori, and that when a given technique becomes a universal form of production, it circumscribes an entire culture, end quote. That's a quote from him. Hence, one might say in short order the need for an architecture of resistance, or at least this is what I felt about it. The second of my 6 points for an architecture of resistance treated with the rise and fall of the concept of the avant-garde, which we still, I think, play around with today, passing from its emergence as a progressive impetus in the middle of the 19th century, and then to its disappearance as a progressive force with the denouement, in my opinion, of the Spanish Civil War and the ensuing disaster of the Second World War. I mean, I think in that sense, the suspension of disbelief in the possibility of an Enlightenment modern project really comes to an end with the Spanish Civil War, with the betrayal, of course, of the Spanish Republic, above all by the Western democracies. My third point for an architectural resistance turned on the idea that an inflected regional expression, also I should say that in this playing around with avant-garde, rise and fall of the avant-garde, I flirted with the idea of arrière-garde, that I felt I was in the position of a rearguard, or that maybe the whole of architecture of quality was in the position of a rearguard. My third point for an architectural resistance turned on the idea that an inflected regional expression is as much a bearer of world culture as it is an embodiment of universal civilization. My point was that a critically regionalist work could be as much a reinterpretation of certain selected aspects of world culture as it was grounded in its own native soil. And this brings to mind, Aalto's Villa Maria, because so many aspects about that, of that building, which make reference back to national romanticism, the particular handling of the fireplace, for example, or the canopy that goes out to connect the main house to the sauna in this kind of mixture of reinforced concrete and timber construction. That building, all of the things I've just said, could be said to be modern and finished, but inside the building there are these black lacquer columns that are bound, and it's clear that these black lacquer columns are a reference to Japan. But they're not Japanisary, they're not kitsch. They make this reference. They are what they are. They are a unique creation in this moment. But here, there is a kind of sense of it's not only in those columns, but the columns are the most obvious example of the presence of Japanese culture in this work. And for that matter, I was in this building with Intabir earlier this afternoon, looking at paintings by the group 7 in Canada in the 20s, and it's obvious that there's certain Japanese influence on that art form. My fourth point was addressed to the phenomenological resistance of the place form, capable of setting itself against the processual, indifferent instrumentality of universal civilization. Herein, of course, I was very much influenced by Heidegger's 1954 essay, Building, Dwelling, Thinking, above all this brief revelatory passage in which he writes, quote, "A boundary is not that at which something stops, but as the Greeks recognized, a boundary is that from which something begins its presencing." I mean, I think it's just an amazing sentence. And here, of course, it could be said that I began to acknowledge the relevance of the phenomenological for the cultivation of a resistant, non-commodified, non-spectacular culture of architecture. You could even say a kind of anti-retinal culture of architecture, to coin the Marcel Duchamp phrase. For me, the idea of the bounded domain carried with it the potentially political corollary of a space of human appearance, as Hannah Arendt had formulated this idea in her 1954 text, The Human Condition, to the effect, and I paraphrase here, this is paraphrasing her, "Only where men live so close together will the potentialities for action remain with them, will power remain with them, And from this point of view, you can see the whole suburban dispersal of the megalopolis, a political operation to neutralize everybody, totally apolitical. Where possibly could one meet? Anywhere. There's nowhere to meet. Maybe the parent-teachers association in school would be the closest one could get to any kind of res publica. My fifth point somehow rotates around the idea of this opposition between culture and nature. This brought me even further under the rubric of phenomenology, in that I emphasized the importance of the topographic, i.e. the earthbound landform dimension of the context, and then also in association with climate and light, wind, etc., and its impact of these factors on built form and on the tectonic essence of that form, by which I intended not only technique, but also the poetics of construction. And to this end, I cited Stanford Anderson's very succinct, but I think precise definition, that the tectonic is not just an act of realizing the requisite construction, but rather the activity that raises this construction to an art. My final point was predicated, this is still these 6 points of an architectural resistance, on the perceptual oscillation between the visual and the tactile. This took me even further, towards the phenomenological, towards emphasizing the quintessential corporeality of our experience of architectonic form, the body being, that is, in its passage through space. In all of this, it has to be conceded that I found myself aligned both historically and otherwise with those figures of the past, Pugin, for example, that remain circumspect as to the individualistic Occidental triumph of the Renaissance. That Marco Frescari wouldn't approve of this. But yes, no, Pugin, of course, had that attitude, and also, as it happens, Auguste Perret. According to its etymology, perspective means rationalized sight or clear seeing, and as such it presupposes a conscious relative suppression of the sense of smell, hearing, taste, touch, and with this, it performs a kind of distancing in terms of the relationship between the body being and the environment. Finally, I went on to link this to Heidegger's critical concept of the loss of nearness, And, well, you can see, my, what can I say, pathological tendencies. I mean, I suppose I find myself closer to Aristotle than to Plato, closer to Vico than to Descartes, closer to Husserl's, can't say the name, the book on the European crisis of science, than to Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolution, who, by the way, doesn't mention Husserl once. As I put it in the conclusion, the tectonic tactilic dialect has the capacity to transcend the visuality of the technical in much the same way as the place form possesses a potential to withstand the onslaught of a kind of globalized instrumentality. 12 years later, in 1995, I endeavored to take this argument further through my book Studies in Tectonic Culture, which was in the main an attempt to trace the evolution of the tectonic in the history of modern architecture, from its critical nexus in France, let's say in the middle of the 18th century, to its ultimate paradoxical manifestation at the end of the 20th century in Norman Foster's Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank. I mean, I seem to be in love with the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, but I think what is quite remarkable about the building is the way in which this problem of the high building is tackled in this particular case by exoskeleton division of the height of the building through the structure itself. However, at a philosophical level, the underlying polemic of this historical excursus was to be found in the introductory chapter of my book on tectonic, given under the title Reflections on the Scope of the Tectonic, where I emphasized two particular aspects determining the limit of the tectonic as a fundamental principle. The first of these aspects stressed the inescapable interplay between heavyweight and lightweight construction, between earthwork and roofwork. I think one can read, the whole of building history and architectural history, also in relation to different climate and resources, in terms of the light, the tensile light element, Japanese house, sitting on minute, relatively speaking, rock foundations, and the masonry wall, the mud brick walls of, let's say, a Middle Eastern house, which rises up from the ground and practically occupies the whole building. There's almost no wood at all, entirely compressive, almost. And so this oscillation between these two things, I think that's one aspect that is key to an understanding of a sort of range of the tectonic, And the second is the world creating cosmogonic potential of all tectonic topographic form. This last fundamental factor has never perhaps been more beautifully expressed than by Vittorio Ghigotti, who in 1983 wrote, well, actually two things. These are two separate quotes. They are about two different aspects, and maybe they are, on the one hand, political and on the other hand, philosophical. The first quote is, "The worst enemy of modern architecture is the idea of space considered solely in terms of its economic and technical exigencies, indifferent to the ideas of sight." And then the second piece is, "Before transforming a support into a column, a roof into a tympanum, before placing stone upon stone, man placed a stone on the ground to recognize a sight in the midst of an unknown universe in order to take account of it and modify it." Such a reflection returns one to Vico and to his contention that the species being enacts itself through history in ways that are not only metaphorical and mythical, but also corporeal, that is to say, through the psycho-sociological impact of form on the body being. This emphasis on the corporeal and the tactile prompted me in studies in tectonic culture to cite the following passage from Adrian Stokes. I quote, "Hand finish is the most vivid testimony to sculpture. A single shape is made magnificent by perennial touching, for the hand explores all unconsciously to reveal and to magnify an existent form," end quote. Or again, Scott Gartner, for his commentary based on Mark Johnson's book, The Body and the Mind, to the effect that, quote, "The philosophical alienation of the body from the mind has resulted in the absence of embodied experience from almost all contemporary theories of meaning in architecture. The body, if it figures into architectural theory at all, is often reduced to an aggregate of needs and constraints. Within this framework, the body and its experience do not participate in the constitution and realization of meaning," end quote. I would add to this Ando's elaboration on the traditional Japanese concept of the body, the word shintai. He writes, quote, "Man articulates the world through his body. Man is not a dualistic being in whom spirit and flesh are essentially distinct, but a living corporeal being active in the world." And he goes on to talk about the here and now as this being taken for granted and subsequently the appearance of a there. Through the living of that distance, the surrounding space becomes manifest as a thing endowed with various meanings and values. The body articulates the world, this is still Ando, and at the same time the body is articulated by the world. In this way, the body, in its dynamic relationship with the world, becomes the shintai, sort of double play. It is only the shintai in this sense that builds and understands architecture, end quote. All of this prompted me to return to the following passage from Ghigotti. Now I'm getting close, of course, to using one quotation after another, this ambition of Walter Benjamin to write a text that consisted of nothing but quotations. This is Ghigotti, also 83. "If there is a clear enemy to fight today, it is represented by the idea of an economic, technical space indifferent in all directions. This is now such a widespread idea that it seems to be almost objective. It is a question of a shrewd modernistic enemy capable of accepting the latest, most fashionable proposal, especially any proposal capable of selling every vain formalistic disguise, favorable only to myth, redundancy, or uproar as a genuine difference. I mean, or again, this is Grigotti, 83. In the course of the last 30 years, during which the obsession with history has taken root, the belief has emerged that architecture cannot be a means for changing social relationships, but I maintain that it is architecture that needs for its production the material represented by social relations, even though the professional tools required for architecture can only be found within that tradition. I mean, it's a very subtle point. Phenomenology aside, if we can put it aside, that which cannot in the end be avoided, at least for architecture, is the constant interaction between tradition and innovation. And here, simultaneously, I am returned to the question as to what can be an authentic tradition for us in this pluralistic, globalized age. The idea of mediating instrumental rationality through an appeal to tradition as a constantly evolving paradigm within the life world is propagated by a philosophy which carries the name of weak thought as an a priori value related to the fragmented nature of the late modern world. Thus, the legacy of any particular historical tradition is always in the process of transforming itself through that which Hans-Georg Gadamer has characterized as the fusion of horizons. For Gadamer, critical reason and tradition are inextricably linked to each other. It's not that Gadamer no longer acknowledges the possibility of an advance in terms of critical reason, but that he refuses to foreclose on the possibility of a dialogical encounter between tradition and reason, which would lead to a higher level of rationality. This also reminds me of Alto, who in Rationalism and Man, I think 1935, says, that without taking into consideration the psychological, it's not possible to talk about rational at all. For Gadamer, Vico's formula entails that we understand history not simply because we've made it, but also because it's made us. We belong to it in the sense that we inherit its experience and project a future on the basis of this. Of this paradox, the founder of weak thought, Gianni Fatimo, had to argue the following. If therefore in architecture, as also in philosophy, in existence in general, we announce any metaphysical, superior, transcendent legitimation of the kind reaching ultimate truths, redemption of humanity, etc., all that is left is to understand legitimation as a form of the creation of horizons of validity through dialogue, a dialogue both with the traditions to which we belong, I'll come back to that again, and with others. This is from his book, The End of Modernity, 1988. And of course, this question of horizons, he was a pupil of Gadamer. Well, there is a sort of chain here. In fact, the chain goes Husserl, Heidegger, Gadamer, Fatimo. In his remarkable critique of critical regionalism, as this is set forth at the end of his perspicacious book, The Seeds of Time, 1994, the Marxist critic Frederick Jameson writes, I quote, "It should be clear enough that an architectural form of critical regionalism would lack all political and allegorical efficacy unless it were coordinated with a variety of other local social and cultural movements that aimed at securing national autonomy. See, for example, this is me, not Jameson, the ultimate absence of such autonomy when it comes to the special relationships obtaining between Great Britain and the United States vis-a-vis, above all, scandalously, the invasion of Iraq, since the British knew that all the evidence was fake, but still went along with it. Domination, spectacular domination." Jameson continues, "On the other hand, there remains a danger of idealism implicit in all forms of cultural nationalism as such, which tends to overestimate the effectivity of culture and consciousness and to neglect the concomitant requirement of economic autonomy. But precisely it is economic autonomy that has been everywhere called back into question in the post-modernity of a genuinely global late capitalism. I mean, of course, you know, the sorry state of the economy in Spain, Italy, Greece, you know, that's the sort of definition of not being able, losing one's sovereignty because one no longer has economic autonomy. Today, I would be the first to accept the fact that critical regionalism and the tactile autonomy of the tectonic, or for that matter, critical phenomenology, can in no way be seen as representing a particular genre of political resistance, except insofar as it can be marginally associated today with the ongoing struggle to resist the draconian omnipotence of the worldwide petrochemical industry, well, petrochemical automotive industry, the rapaciousness of which continues without any political redress, except possibly in France, where so far it's illegal to do hydrofracking, but not anywhere else, as far as I can see. The causal link between the unbridled expansion of this corporate industry and the visible and seemingly unstoppable destruction of the environment seems to be beyond any dispute. I have in mind, of course, the melting of the ice cap and the concomitant increasing occurrence of extreme weather conditions such as we've experienced in the last 24 hours. There remains for me only the possibility, and we might say even responsibility, of continuing to cultivate a marginal corporal architecture as a kind of fragmentary, critical holding operation across the surface of the earth, including within its prospect the fragmentary realization of a truly sustainable, i.e. durable building culture, one which seeks to maintain, against the onslaught of universal civilization, a space of public appearance in the Arantian sense. Thank you. Right, good.